My first video, Challenge Atheist, spurred a lot of controversy. That was great. I got a lot of comments, 100% from atheists, trying to object in any possible way to the argument that I made in my video. That argument was based on just one simple definition of God, because I said if we define God in a very serious way, we can demonstrate that atheism becomes unreasonable. And that definition that I gave of God was we define God as the necessary, uncaused cause of everything that exists. Atheists started to bring down this definition, object to this in many different directions. Today, I would like to discuss the objection that came from several YouTuber that I think is the most compelling one. And this objection is about the idea of causation. And the main idea is your definition of God is impossible because there cannot be any cause preceding space-time, preceding the universe, preceding everything that exists. Really? Let's go over that today. The atheist objection goes along this line of thinking. Causation is something that happens in time. Because when we have causation, we have a cause and then an effect. If I throw a stone into a lake, first I throw the stone and then I see the water splashing. Okay? The opposite doesn't work. All right. So what? Well, since time is something that is specific of the universe we live in, and specifically of what in physics we call space-time, which is this four-dimensional entity that Einstein basically described and saw for the first time, where space and time are interconnected. Well, only within this space-time where we live, causation has a meaning because time makes sense only if you have a space time. And so, to even start talking about the cause of something, first you need to have the idea of time. If you don't have the idea of time, meaning of what happens first and what happened after, the idea of causation is just a no-go. It's not even there. You cannot even imagine causation in any other possible way. And so, if time exists only if a space-time is already given, or in other words, time started at the time of Big Bang, and before the Big Bang or before the existence of space-time, time is not even a concept anymore. Well, nothing, no cause can precede the beginning of space-time, right? Because if I have a cause that comes before space-time, it means that between that cause and the beginning of space-time, there's some time in between. But time doesn't mean anything here. It just starts here. And so causation is impossible. The space-time cannot be possibly caused by anything because there's no enough time, let's put it that way, to have somebody or something that caused the space-time to come into existence. Therefore, your definition of God, which I repeat, is the necessary and cause of everything that exists, is an impossible definition. And so your God does not exist. This is a very smart objection, but let's see if we can poke holes into this. Actually, this objection is very weak. Why? Because I'll show that this objection, what it does really is just begging the question. Basically, ultimately, what this objection does is assuming that no possible God as I defined can exist, Therefore, God does not exist. This objection, ultimately, I'll show, it just assumes the conclusion that he wants to demonstrate. That's a logical fallacy. It's begging the question. Why? Because when atheist starts arguing and saying causation can only happen if you have an event here and then an event here after a certain amount of time, they are limiting their definition of causation to natural phenomena. In the universe, when we observe causation, or what I would call natural causation, what we observe is indeed what atheists describe. We see an event, and then after a certain amount of time, another event. And we connect it and say event B was caused by event A. The fact that the water splashed around, it's because was caused by the fact that I threw a stone in the lake. In general, I have no problem with this definition of causation if we're talking about natural causation. That's what happens in nature. A phenomenon causes another phenomenon, and that happens in time. What I have a problem with is if we restrict all possible causation to natural causation. Why should we believe that causation only works if we have an event and then another event separated by a certain amount of time? Yes, this is what we experience in our universe. But I argue that trying to extrapolate from this that no other possible causation is possible begs the question. Because, of course, if you assume that no other possible causation other than one that happens in time exists, then since there's no time before the beginning of the space-time, no causation can happen before the space-time, so no God causing the space-time to exist can exist. But again, this is begging the question. In fact, when I gave the definition of God, the necessary and cause of everything that existed, I didn't have in mind natural causation at all. I didn't specify what kind of causation I had in mind. And in fact, I didn't have in mind natural causation. Because I don't think that God created the universe or created the space-time or caused the space-time to exist as me throwing a stone in the water causes this water to splash. It would be silly of me to think something like that. Why? Because I'm not thinking of God as a being or an entity that exists in time. If I did, I would have to imagine God that does nothing for a certain amount of time, maybe an infinite amount of time, until at a certain point he gets bored of being there alone and doing nothing, and he decides all of a sudden to create space-time. But this is a very silly, naive understanding of God. But as soon as I point out that when I talk about God causing everything to exist, I'm not talking about natural causation. Atheists jump on their chair and they start asking, show me an example of non-natural causation. Because all the causation I know of is natural causation that works in time. If you want me to start believing or even being open to your possibility, to your potential God, just give me a positive example that I can verify of something that happened not through natural causation. I'm waiting. This request that may seem reasonable on the surface is flawed with two main logical fallacies. Fallacy number one: let's assume that I cannot come up with any example of non-natural causation. Does from that follow that no non-natural causation is possible? No. it would be a non-logical extrapolation. Let me give you an example. If somebody comes to you and says, you know what, all swans are white, and you're like, yes, but why are you saying that? I think that I'm open to the possibility that there may be black swans also. Well, that's impossible. I've seen thousands of swans in my life, and all the swans I've ever seen, they were all white. Have you seen any black swans? And I may say, no, you're right. I myself has only ever seen white swans. But can we conclude that then no swans are black? Or that it's impossible the swans are black? No, we cannot. We cannot get to that type of extrapolations. In fact, black swans exist and they're very rare. But if I were not able to provide you with any possible example, verifiable example of non natural causation, the most that you could say is, based on all the evidence that I collected, you know what? I think that the probability that non natural causation may occur is absolutely improbable. Can I demonstrate that the probability of non natural causation is exactly zero? No, you cannot, because you cannot get to that extrapolation. The most you can say is that it's highly improbable. Attach whatever probability you want to touch, 1%, 0.1%, 10 to the negative 5%. I don't care. It's not zero. You cannot get to zero for the example that I just gave. And that's exactly your problem. You know what? You probably know about Sherlock Holmes, the famous investigator. He became famous because he was able to solve all the most complicated cases, because at the end he was excluding all the possibilities, and the only one remaining, even if it was absolutely crazy and absolutely unlikely, since it was the only one that was left, well, turned out to be the one. So that tiny probability that that was the real martyr, okay, that guy was the martyr, that if you knew nothing was probably close to zero, as close as you may want. Once you exclude everybody else, well, there's only one solution, that the murderer was that guy. So that little probability that was almost zero, but not zero, turned out to blow up to 100%. That's exactly what may happen here. You can say as much as you want that that probability of non natural causation is very, 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 very low, but you will never be able to demonstrate that is zero. And if I can demonstrate to you that at a certain in certain condition, that's the only possible reasonable explanation for what we see, then as Sherlock Holmes would say, well, that must be the only possibility. That is exactly what I'm claiming in this case. If we assume just natural causation, of course, we cannot get a reasonable explanation of why the universe exists in the way that it exists. You have to admit that the universe is there just because it's there. Space-time is there just because it's there. It's not satisfactory. It's unreasonable. And so, if I tell you that the only way to make sense of the existence of space-time is assuming that space-time was caused by no natural cause, God, then if that is the only possible explanation of something so unreasonable as the existence of space-time, well, I'm going to conclude that that is the reason of space-time. Which brings me to the second logical fallacy, the one that I call the science of the gaps. You probably know that atheists use this expression, God of the gaps, to highlight a fallacy in the theism argument. They say, whatever thing in nature you cannot explain, you call God. And so you fill all these gaps by using God. For example, we don't really know how life evolved, how life came to be, how the first cells got together to create the first organisms. We have a wild hypothesis, but science cannot, and so far has not been able to provide any solid evidence of how to put together all the elements of a cell into a cell. Well, if you start saying, well, that's because God created that, they're saying, no, you are basically using God to fill up the gaps of your knowledge. One day, science is going to be able to explain that, and you don't need God anymore. In fact, if you go back 2,000 years ago, people thought that the lightnings from the sky were sent by Zeus. Now we know and we can explain very well why the lightnings come from the sky. So this God is useless. You're just using to bridge those gaps of knowledge that you don't have. It's a logical fallacy. I kind of agree with this. Well, atheists use the same logic on the reverse side. They use science to fill their gaps in things that science will never be able to explain. Okay? They apply this methodology to the beginning of the universe or to the existence of space-time, saying, for example, well, we don't really know, science doesn't really know at this point why the universe came to be, but maybe one day science will. They will explain us why the universe all of a sudden came to be. Or they throw there, oh, then maybe science is going to explain that the universe actually was there always in a cyclical way of big bangs and big crunches, okay? Or whatever cosmological model you want to have. Okay? I call this science of the gaps. Why? Because science cannot be possibly used to explain why the space-time exists. You can a physical model that explains how the space-time evolves the way we see it's evolving. For example, expanding and accelerating. You can come up with many different models. And actually, physicists have been doing this for decades now to try to explain how the universe is evolving, how the stars are forming. But science will never be able to tell you why all these have to be. There's no reason, in fact, that this has to be. And science is not the right tool that you should use to respond to this question. Why? Because this question, why everything that exists, is a metaphysical question. It's not a scientific question. And science is the wrong tool to answer a metaphysical question. To answer a metaphysical question, you need to reply by using philosophy and logic, not by using science. Science, it's powerful and it's beautiful as long as you use it correctly. Science can tell you how a system that is in a certain initial condition and evolves under certain laws evolves and can predict, if the model is good enough, can predict well how that system is going to evolve. But the science needs those initial conditions and needs those laws before starting to be applied. Science cannot explain why those initial conditions are the way they are, and will never be able to explain why the laws that regulate and govern that particular phenomenon are the way they are. Those are given. You need to give those inputs to science, to scientific models, so that models can work. So you cannot put science before the initial condition or before the laws of physics to explain why, because science will never be able to explain why. It only explains the how. I call this fallacy the Science of the gaps. There's something I cannot explain. Well, science will explain. No, science will never be able to explain why the universe is in existence. Not how, why. And in fact, it's very easy to expose these logical fallacies of the science of the gaps. In every conversation you may have with an atheist, there's always be a point where they're going to start asking you for positive proofs of known natural causations. They're saying if you are assuming that the space-time, that the universe was caused by something that is not natural and doesn't follow the laws of natural causation, that is happening in time, as we were explaining before, then please provide me an example. Give me a tangible, provable example of something that happens or happened that was produced not by a causal natural cause. This question, beware, is not an honest question. Why? It's easy to expose the fact that this is not an honest question because we, in fact, can provide tons of examples of known natural causation. Think about all those miraculous healing that are reported every year. Now, what does miraculous healing mean? Well, it means that the scientific community cannot possibly explain how those healings occurred. Or all those miracles in the past that, again, were experienced by hundreds, if not thousands of people. Think about, for example, the miracle of the dancing sun in Fatima, experienced by thousands of people, recorded, and even experienced by people that were not believers, that after that miracle, they became believers. Or other example, all those near death experiences of people that are on the verge of dying, and for some reason they have these out of body experiences where they see themselves lying in bed in the hospital, and then they go back and they provide information on what they've seen from high above, information that they cannot possibly have got anywhere else. There are all these type of things that science cannot possibly explain. And so what is the answer if you bring up all of these hundreds of different examples? You already know what the answer is. Hallucination, incredulity, and science will be able to explain all this one day. That's the problem. That's the science of the gaps. There's no example that you can provide, of non-natural causation that will prevent an atheist to say either it's the cause of mass hallucination or it's something that science anyway eventually is going to explain it. So you see where the problem is. The question is not an honest question. Provide me with a positive example, no natural causation. Well, here's a miraculous healing. Here's another miraculous healing. Here's hundreds of miraculous healing. Here's all the hundreds Eucharistic miracles that were explored by the scientific community. They don't have a possible explanation. These are all the near end experiences. These are all the miracles that were experienced by thousands of people, and go on and on and on. And to each and every one of them, they're going to respond, no, I don't believe it. No, they were just hallucinating. No, they were just poor, credulous people. No, well, this may not be explainable now, but science one day will be able to explain. They will dismiss one after the other because they already have their answer. Hallucination, incredulity, science of the gaps. Hallucination, incredulity, science of the gap. And so this question is not an honest question because they have already decided a priori that no natural causation cannot possibly be. And all those examples they may imply or may hint that no natural causation is possible, that cannot possibly be, because science will one day be able to explain it. But you understand the logical fallacies of this. It's a circle argument, it's begging the question. You are assuming that non natural causation is impossible because science anyway will be able one day to explain everything, and conclude then that no natural causation is impossible. You are assuming your conclusion. You are lost in this circle argument in which you have put yourself and from which nobody will ever be able to save you.